where we're in that span between our MOI testing and maybe the testing season if you're in a state that does their high stakes assessments in the spring. And so there's this, I think, pressure to feel like we need to get kids in the right groups at the right time, and there's no time to waste. And really that urgency happens all year, but I think right now that's really the top of everyone's mind. So tonight what we're hoping we can do is give you some support to think about how you might use that small group instruction time with your students the most efficiently possible that you possibly can, and to target those skills. So here are our objectives tonight. And Larissa and I thought it might be helpful if, as much as we would love to dialogue with all of you, we're going to really kind of dialogue with each other. So I've asked Larissa to interrupt me as questions pop up in the feed that you want to ask, or things that I suspect or that she knows might be hot topics or hot questions for all of you. So this is going to be a little interactive in that way. I also wanted to let you know that you will have a copy of the slides, and the recording will be made available too. So before we get started, I do want to share with you that some of the resources that I'm referencing in this presentation again are on the ends of at the end of the slides if you want those. But I'm going to be talking quite a bit about Susan Hall's text, the 10 success factors. And then another one you may or may not be familiar with, which is student-focused coaching. Again, these are at the end of the slides. And a key one, which is one of my personal favorites, is effective universal instruction. And I have to thank Stephanie Stoller for drawing my attention to that book. So throughout our time together this evening, really what we want to do is talk about first a problem-solving process, and how in order for us to really maximize that small group time, we have to have a strategy in place. And that strategy is really going to start with our data. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different assessment tools we might be using and how we can use them for their intended purposes to get the information that we need. We'll also then go into, well, what is an intervention? What are the attributes that make something truly an intervention? And a topic that might not be one that you've really thought about or maybe talked about out loud with your colleagues is the costs and benefits of whole group versus small group. Maybe things that you've been thinking about, but we're going to put some structure around that thought process. And then we'll end tonight with looking at some samples of what small group instruction could look like in a classroom at 2 different grade levels. So Larissa, how does that sound so far?
Sounds great.
Okay, so I'll do my best to stay timely so we can get through all of those things. So let's start off talking about a data-driven problem-solving process. And that might be something that you've engaged in conversations at your school about, and you may already have a really good system. So if you have a system that's working, I'm not suggesting that you change it. This is really around supporting people who might not have a solid system in place yet. And so you might be thinking, what does this have to do with small group instruction? So in order for us to really maximize that small group time, the best thing that we can do is make sure our universal instruction's working. If we don't have a solid universal instruction component, then we're just going to find ourselves in situations where more students need intervention than we have the manpower or the resources to support. So before we can even talk about what small group looks like, we have to reduce the number of kids that need something different in small group time. So universal is going to be our first component, and it has to meet the needs of all students. This isn't something that, it's okay for the universal instruction to work for a group of students. It needs to work for all. And if it doesn't work for all, our first step is to fix our universal instruction. The other thing we need to be thinking about is when we do identify a need for small group should be very targeted and very specific and efficient. Our small group instruction shouldn't be where we deliver the same thing for all students just in a small group setting. Small groups are most efficient when everybody gets exactly what they need. And in order to do that, we again have to start with a problem-solving system. So the thing that I feel like we need to start with first is really getting some common language around what is mastery. Because oftentimes when we think small group, we think Okay, so we're going to put students in this intensive strategic intervention because they haven't mastered a skill. Well, what do we mean when we say mastery? So I thought this was interesting. Again, I found this in the Effective Universal Instruction book, and the date stood out to me. This is 1978. This is not new information, but this definition of mastery was very succinct for me in that it's a four-step process. So if we think about, in order for students to master something, they have to first acquire the skill. That means they need to understand it, they need to be accurate with it. So that's first. Fluency is the next step. So we can't focus on fluency until they're accurate. We don't want them to get faster at doing something incorrectly. So once they've gotten that understanding, then we need to work on getting that fluency and automaticity down. Once they've reached that level, being able to generalize that information outside of the setting that we practiced it in is essential. So I see oftentimes, or I hear from teachers, my students are really doing well on my phonics instruction, but when it comes to reading text, even if it's decodable, they're not applying what they've learned. So I hear a lot of that. Or I've taught syllable division, but when it comes to working on an unknown multisyllabic word, they're not doing what I taught them. Well, that's the generalization. And so most students don't jump from being automatic with something to applying it outside of the context. So that's part of our job, is to help them see how to generalize. But again, that's not mastery yet. It's not until they get to adaptation that they have truly mastered something. And so adaptation is a much more advanced skill. So as a student, my teachers taught me something, I've applied it in a different context, and now I'm in a situation where it doesn't work quite that way. And so I have to do some of my own thinking and constructing and modifying or trying a different technique to apply this knowledge. So where this fits in is oftentimes when we work with groups of students and we assess them to see if they've mastered something, we typically assess at the acquisition or at the fluency stage. So we get this false sense that they've mastered something and they really haven't. And so what happens is a few weeks down the road, they end up in the intervention group for the exact same thing. So when we're thinking small group, we need to be thinking about how far are we getting students in this mastery sequence to ensure that they've truly acquired the skill and can retain it.
I love that you highlight mastery as a four-step process.
I wish I could take credit for all that smarts right there, but definitely that came from Herring and Eaton way back in 1970.
Yeah. Well, I think it really helps us talk about kids when we're problem solving.
Right. And again, planning and assessing our students. So when we think about mastery and we think about assessing, one of the frameworks that I really like, just in terms of illustrating this process, is McKenna and Stahl's cognitive model. And what you're seeing here on the screen is really the way that some skills progress in a very linear fashion and sequential fashion, some don't. But when we want to identify what students are having difficulty with, we often don't know the answer from the single data point that we have. We often have to do some work to pinpoint where the deficits could be so that we can be more intentional in our instruction. So if I could describe what this problem-solving model is in a very short time, I would set it up in a way that gives you kind of a step-by-step process. So first, we need to have a really solid and effective, reliable, valid universal screening tool. And that universal screening tool really should be administered, 3 times a year at key points, beginning, middle, and end. And so that universal screener is going to do a couple things for us. One of the things it's going to do is identify the students who aren't reaching those grade level benchmarks. They're the students that are telling us that they need us to pay attention and figure out what their areas of instruction are. So that's step one. And so if I were looking at this reading comprehension on the far right-hand side, for many assessments that schools are using, especially as we get to second grade and up, it may be a reading comprehension-based assessment. And so we would get a data point that would say the students were at risk. But we don't know from that data point what they need. That's just step one. So the next thing we have to do in our problem-solving model is to back up only as far as we need to get the answer to our question. And the answer is we need to investigate what are the underlying factors that could be causing the performance level that they're currently at. So again, if it's a reading comprehension assessment, I have to go back and I have to see, could it possibly be a word recognition issue? Could they even decode the passage? And so if you look at the top band here, automatic word recognition is the question I want to answer. Can they accurately and automatically read this text that they had to comprehend? And if I listen to them read out loud, maybe doing, an oral reading fluency assessment, I would get an answer to that question. I might discover, yikes, they are not reading accurately and automatically. Our accuracy percentage is pretty low, and their rate is showing me that this was a very labor-intensive task for them. And because it was labor-intensive, it was unlikely that they were able to really attend to the meeting. And so that would tell me I need to back up the next step, and I need to assess what their decoding, word level decoding is like. What phonics concepts do they know? What phonics needs do they have? And if my answer is done and I have the information I need, I don't need to go back any further. But if I know that decoding is a real problem, I might need to go back and do a phonemic awareness assessment to see if that's what's causing the weak decoding. So again, in a problem-solving model, it's drilling down as far as we need to get the data that we need to tell us what to do next. And so the ultimate goal here is to be able to isolate the variables in our assessment tools. And so that means we have to really think about what's available to us. So I want us to talk for just a moment about the assessment tools that we have. And do we know if they're working for us? So when I think about this quote, so this is from Susan Hall, I want us to pause here for just a moment because I think this is a common misconception. Sometimes it's a misconception because we've gotten into habits in schools that this is just how we've done things. Sometimes it's a branding issue and things have been miscommunicated as filling multiple purposes. But this is telling us that an assessment can't be both a universal screener and a diagnostic tool at the same time. If it's good to universally screen, it's going to be quick, it's going to be a short administration window, it's just going to give us a high-level profile of whether students are meeting those needs at that given period of time. But it's not going to pinpoint exactly what the variables are. A diagnostic tool is going to do that. And so a diagnostic tool is going to have to then be more comprehensive. It's going to be longer to administer, and it's going to look at a specific question that I have about that student. So again, if you're doing one of those things, it's very unlikely you're going to be effective at the other. So a couple of key characteristics to just draw attention to is the purpose of each type of assessment. So the purpose of a universal screener isn't to pinpoint what the specific skill deficit might be. It's to identify who's at risk, who's not meeting those benchmarks at that point in time. It's also to help us see trends, whether they're trends across the classroom or a grade level or even a school. Again, that might not tell us exactly what's going on, but it's going to give us a high-level overview. And so that's a broad picture. We can still make some good decisions based on that, but that's not going to pinpoint what small group instruction should look like. So again, we need to think about that universal screener is telling us about our universal instruction. Whereas a diagnostic tool is going to drill down and it's going to look at specific skills. It's going to be used to answer questions that we have about students, and it's going to give us a more in-depth picture of what that student looks like so that we know where we should begin our intervention.
Jamey, could you just give a few examples of effective universal screeners and then maybe a few diagnostic tools as well?
Yeah, so, and I'm sure the list is so much more comprehensive. I'm just going to throw out a few that I know are widely used. So Acadience, and again, it includes many, many grades, and the different measures will be recommended at different points in time in different grades. But again, that would be one that's commonly used. One that's commonly used here in Indiana is NWEA. And so I'm gonna, not endorse some over others, but those are ones that you're probably hearing about often. And then a diagnostic tool, there's so many diagnostic tools. But again, picking the right one is going to have to really relate to what's your question. So if my question is around, is it a word recognition or phonics skill? I might do a core phonics survey. I might do, something related to my intervention program that I'm working on, so I know where to place them. Phonemic awareness, I might do the past as an assessment to drill down and see what phonemic awareness deficits are. So when we think about, again, the assessment tools available, I liked this quote again in terms of why a diagnostic assessment has to be in our toolbox of things that we're using with students, because it's the gateway, I love that word, to group students by skill deficit. And so in order for us to be effective and efficient in what we're teaching, we first have to know what the need is. And our diagnostic tools are going to tell us that. So to recap this part of that problem-solving model, we need to make sure that we're using our universal screeners to look for classroom or grade level trends, because we might see that there's something in our core that needs to be supported or enhanced, because remember, we want to reduce the number of students that even need an intervention in the first place. And then we use our diagnostic tools to look for error patterns. And when we're doing that diagnostic, we might get an answer pretty early on. We might just end up with more questions that need to be explored through additional assessments. So there, in Susan Hall's text, I thought there was a really good list around what characteristics should we look for to make sure we have good diagnostic tools. And so instead of reading through these, I just want to remind you that these are available to you afterwards. I do want to feature a couple of key ones, though, that I think are important to draw attention to. One is that a good diagnostic assessment is going to group the measures based on specific skills. So it's not going to be like, this, a buffet of things. It's going to be very specific. I want to know about phonemic awareness, or I want to know about basic phonics skills or advanced phonics skills. And then the other one, that it should be organized so that it progresses either from easy to more complex or complex to easy, but there's some logic to give you guidance about where to start and what to target. And these should still be very quick to administer. We really can't afford to spend 30 or 40 minutes per student getting diagnostic data. So we talked about assessments. We talked about the need to be able to use them for specific purposes. And now I want to shift gears a little bit. So I'm going to pause and see, Larissa, if we have any questions about that topic before we start talking about what makes an intervention effective.
Yeah, we have one additional question in the chat I wanted to ask. Can you give an example of a comprehension diagnostic tool?
So that's definitely an area of opportunity for me, but the CFAL, which is also by Acadians, is one that I've had some practice using recently. That does specifically look at language comprehension indicators. And I might invite Amy Murdoch to add any, if you can think of any off the top of your head, that you would recommend. Not to put you on the spot, but I guess to kind of put you on the spot. So I'll give her a chance to either weigh in or type in the chat.
Sorry, I was I was trying to find I was multitasking and trying to find my tools. One of the things that I always say about assessments is I always think a diagnostic assessment is best connected to the intervention you're doing. So as Jamey nicely said, it's like a question-driven process, and I have a question about reading comprehension. So I'm going to look at the intervention program that I'm using, or the instructional program that I'm going to use, and understand what are the background knowledge or the vocabulary assessments that might be connected to that instructional approach. And I really find that that's the best kind of diagnostic. So we talk about like intervention-based diagnostic. And so sometimes you do need independent information. So as Jamey said, the CFAL is great. The other one that I've used is, I'm going to forget the assessment guidebook by CORE. Is it CORE? Is that the right? I feel like there's another word after CORE.
The teaching reading source book, or?
Yeah, it's the same people who do the teaching reading source book. They have an assessment.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just the assessment.
Yeah, which handbook. Which has maybe we can put it in the chat. I'll find it and I can put it in the question and answer, but it's it's kind of a general informal assessment, or it's formal assessment, but criteria reference. Yeah, assessment. Yep, thanks. The multiple measures one. So I like that one sometimes when I need more general information about a child. But again, I think the best one is one that's connected to the intervention or instructional program that you're using, that really helps you make decisions about where does this child need to go next in terms of instruction. So.
Perfect. Good. See, I'm glad I put you on the spot. I knew you would have some addition.
So you caught me multitasking, but I was listening.
Well, so let's talk then, once we have our data, what does make an intervention effective? And so oftentimes when we think about that question, or if somebody were to ask me, the first thing that tends to come up in the conversation is group size and dosage or frequency. And those are super critical variables to consider, but there are some. So I'm going to just invite you to think and jot down on your paper, if you have paper handy, what are the words that come to mind? So we're going to take dosage and frequency and group size off the table for just a moment. What other words would you think of when you're thinking about intervention? So I'm just going to give you about 15 seconds to reflect on that. And here are the words that I see often and think of when I look at recommended intervention programs. So specialized. So they are intended to go after something very specific. So it's not a broad like a universal core. It is specialized for a specific skill. It's intensive. So because it is specialized, it can move quickly, or it can move very intentionally in a well-constructed scope and sequence, again, just in that one area. It's intentional in its design, so it's going to be very explicit. So intentional and explicit are not synonymous, but things that are done intentionally with a goal in mind are best done with explicit instruction, and consistent. So we talk about consistent, the routines and procedures should be very similar, because when students are having difficulty learning a skill, what we want to do is minimize the cognitive overload that's created when they're trying to figure out what the direction of the activity is. So if I'm constantly changing activities because I want to make it interesting for them, what I might be doing without realizing is causing cognitive overload, because they're trying to understand the expectations and the directions and to figure out the task. So it's not the task that's important, it's the skill that's important. The task should support the skill, not distract from the skill. So consistent language, consistent routines and procedures are very important. And whenever possible, and as much as possible, the consistency from what they're receiving in the core and what they're getting in the intervention should be there. We don't want to take our students who are having difficulty learning the information and double the content that they're learning, which often happens when they have a core that they're participating in and the intervention is very different. So as much as we can, we need to be consistent again in our language, the academic language that we're using, and a lot of the routines and procedures. And all of that can be summarized by having a well-structured intervention. So one thing that I thought was very interesting, and again, this isn't a new piece of research, this is Hattie, 2009, and this gets to a lot of misconceptions around what makes interventions effective. So simply placing students in a small group, even if a group is homogeneous and these students have the same need, is not enough. So it's not magical just to put them in a small group and deliver something. It has to be very intentional in terms of the materials and the teaching that we're using, that it's challenging in an appropriate way, not a frustrating way, and that we're always focused on meeting the needs of the students. So that means we need to be adjusting and we need to be giving lots of feedback. So defining what this looks like is where we're going next. So when we're thinking about planning our instruction, our small group instruction needs to be very prescriptive. So the whole purpose of us drilling down into that diagnostic data is to find the specific skill needs that those students have. Once we find those needs, then we're ready to design our lessons, and our lessons need to be explicit. They need to use, again, consistent language and routines. We need to give concrete examples as much as possible. Often students that are having difficulty with literacy skills, language and overloading language and teacher talk can compete with the attention they need to be giving to those skills. So giving visual models, giving them concrete examples, reducing our language to simple prompts will help them pay attention and really give the focus of language on the skill that they're doing and not on the teacher talking. And then when we're delivering that instruction, using that gradual release of I do, we do, you do is essential, because we, again, don't want the focus to be on understanding the task. We want it to be on the skill. We need to make sure that we're providing intentional practice opportunities. And this is an area of interest for me. So we'll talk a little bit about different types of practice. So when does massed practice become really important, and what is massed practice? And when does cumulative spaced practice or interleaving become important? And a key piece that I want us to keep in mind is the point here that every instructional minute is important, not to add any pressure to you that you might already be feeling. But when we think about our small group instruction, the point here is that it's expensive. And it's expensive for a couple of reasons. It's expensive in terms of manpower, because now we're, again, focusing our attention on a very small group of kids. But it's also expensive in terms of instructional cost. So when I'm working with a small group of students, they're getting what they need from me. And the rest of the class, especially if I don't have another adult in the room available, they're working independently. And so there is a cost for those students too, because they're not receiving instruction. It's not that that time isn't important and meaningful in some way, but they're not going to get as much out of that as they are when they're with the teacher table. So that really gets us to, well, what are the costs and benefits? Because both types of instruction are essential, but how do we make good decisions about when to do which type of instruction? So let's start with whole group instruction. And so we know that no matter how well our universal instruction is looking, no matter how well we're monitoring our data, there are still going to be students that are going to surface as needing more than what we're providing in our universal instruction. But the point here is that when we have an identified skill from our assessment data that shows that less than 60% of our students are meeting the threshold for that skill, we do have to intervene, but we may need to intervene in a whole group model. And the reason for that is, if the need is that great on a skill, it is more efficient and effective to meet that need because it's shared among a majority of the students than it would be to try to meet that need in several small groups. So we're going to come back to that and talk about how that's possible, and can it really be considered an intervention if it's not small group? So before we go there, I want to reinforce again what we know about why we would actually want to be concerned about minimizing our small group time. And the reason we want to minimize that small group time is because, again, even when you are doing a fabulous job planning these well evidence-based small group opportunities for students to do independently, that is important for us to consider, but it's still not as effective as what they would be getting from direct teacher time and feedback and supervised practice. And so there is a cost to that independent work time. And so we want to make sure that we reduce the amount of time that students are spending independently. And the best way to do that is, again, to reduce the overall small group time down to what's essential. So when we think about that, again, continue to do your evidence-based independent workstations, but make sure that those are not the bulk of your literacy block. If you do have another adult in the classroom, then perhaps your small group time could be a little bit longer because you've still reduced the amount of independent time because students have twice the opportunity to meet with an adult. But if you do not have additional support staff available, again, your goal is to reduce that time as much as possible that they would be working independently. And so the best way to do that, again, is to first look at what is working in our universal instruction and what do we need to support or intervene on in a whole group model. So our whole group intervention still should be intensive and structured and consistent. So when I'm thinking about my data, and if my data is indicating, again, that a large group of my classroom has that specific need, and we're going to look at a sample to see what that would look like in a classroom summary, then I'm going to provide that same targeted intervention that I would have done in a small group setting, but I'm going to do it for everybody. And I'm going to just teach the skill that my data says that they need as a whole group. And when I'm providing that intervention, something that makes a big difference and very easy to do is just increasing the opportunity for students to get practice and feedback. And so that's really where our different types of practice come into play. So I wanted to share a quote from Hattie. And so this is really about getting to think through different types of practice. So I want to introduce you to two terms, spaced and massed. So massed practice, which is often known as blocked practice, is really similar to what you might do when you were in school as a student yourself, studying vocabulary words for a test, or maybe prepping for a spelling test. And it's that cramming. It's practicing the same thing over and over again until you feel like you've memorized it. So that blocked or massed practice is, again, that cramming. I'm just focusing on one thing, and it becomes pretty automatic fairly quickly in that setting. Whereas spaced practice is, I'm going to practice that thing today, and I'm going to go away from it, and I'm going to practice it later. And I'm going to go away a little longer than I did the first time, and I'm going to practice it again. And what's interesting about spaced practice is we don't often feel like we've learned it as well, but it's actually more effective in being retained longer. In fact, here's what researchers have found about the difference between spaced and massed. So oftentimes what we think works is not actually what does work. And so this is showing on the left-hand side, this is the proportion of correct items that were tested for a group of students in this study. And so what they did is they gave students the same content to study, and they gave them 3 different structures for studying. So the first structure was just asking them to recall something. And that would be, just think about or quiz yourself or reread it. That's just the simple recall. So if we look at the proportion, we're at about just a little over like 25% chance of recalling it accurately at that point. Massed practice was we studied that same thing over and over and over again. So maybe we studied it 15 times in a row. But look at how just recalling and retrieving and practicing it massed didn't have a big difference in our accuracy. It's about the same. Whereas spaced, we studied it, we came back to it later, we gave ourselves a little forgetting time, we came back to it again. Look at the accuracy difference when we utilize a spaced practice model. So
Jamey, that's incredible.
It is incredible. I mean, I read that and went, that's not right, which led me down the rabbit hole of, turns out that's right.
Yeah, and I don't think that spaced practice has been something that we've really been taught in our schools of education or in our programs, or even maybe in our structured literacy training.
And why I think that's important in this conversation is around, our students who are having difficulty, remember with that mastery, getting to that level of adaptation. Well, to have that level of knowledge with a skill means you have to be very proficient with it. You have to be accurate and fluent. Remember, that came before. But if I'm not remembering something and I'm not accurate at it, so this is the proportion correct, then I'm not going to master the skill. And so when I think about that whole group intervention, and I think about, gosh, a lot of kids are struggling, my first thought is, how can I take that skill that they're having difficulty with and embed in my universal instruction opportunities to do spaced practice of that thing they have not yet mastered? Because if I can't ensure that they retain it and retain it accurately, I can't get them to mastery with it. And so again, I think in terms of being super efficient, whenever our students indicate that a great deal of them are having difficulty, the first step is cumulative review in a spaced practice setting. We just have to stop the bleeding there. And that, again, will free us up to deal with our small group situation more specifically.
Is this something that would occur across the school day and across the week maybe, or what, like ideally, what would that look like?
Yeah, well, let's stick with our reading block example. So let's say you're working with a group of fourth graders, and one of the things that maybe you did a maze assessment, and the maze assessment, showed you that a lot of kids were not hitting benchmark, and so you did your problem solving, you drilled down, and you gave an oral reading fluency passage and realized, gosh, it's accuracy. And maybe you got enough from your error observation to say it's multisyllabic words that are the problem. What I might do there is every day as my literacy block is stopping, I might incorporate a 5-minute review of let's go through and let's walk through our syllable division strategies of these words. And I probably would pull words out of the text that we're reading because I want them to break the words apart, and then I want them to visit them again as they're reading the story. So that's how I would approach it. And I would do it probably for a few minutes on a Monday, Tuesday. Maybe I review a different skill as my cumulative review on Wednesday, Thursday, because I want to create space so they forget. And maybe come Friday, I hit that same syllable division pattern lesson again.
Great, thank you. And I'm glad that you used the fluency and the maze and comprehension as an example, because that was in the chat as well.
Perfect. All right. So one more view of this, practice topic is this is looking at that same type of model, masked or blocked on this diagram, and interleaved. Now, interleaved is a little different than spaced. So interleaved is, I'm going to give you a math example for a moment. So interleaved would be, I'm doing a couple of multiplication problems with regrouping, and then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do is this an isosceles or a scaling triangle? And then I'm going to move on and I'm going to do a different geometry task. And then I'm going to come back to maybe division with regrouping. So I don't even know if those are the right math terms anymore. But what I'm doing is I am doing really a mixed review. And those mixed review opportunities give my brain a chance to have some difficulty, some productive difficulty, because when I do the same type of problem over and over again, I kind of go on autopilot and I don't really think about what I'm actually doing. But when the types of activities are varied and I have to stop and shift gears, my brain stops and it has to retrieve, wait, what am I doing? What's my process? And it seems counterproductive. It seems like, well, that's not what you want, right? We want our students to be so automatic. Actually, that's not what we want, because when we do things without thinking, we don't remember them. When we're forced to stop and think and struggle a little bit, we've increased the opportunity for it to be there when we need it. One of my favorite things that I've heard Anita Archer say over the years is this expression, retrieve, respond, retain. So when I ask a student to retrieve something, and they are forced to respond either orally or in writing, I've increased the chance that they retain it. Well, cognitive scientists have told us that another way to increase the chance that they'll retain it is to make them have a little bit of struggle, not frustration. That's not the same, but struggle, like effort. And so interleaving is a really good way to do that. So what this is showing you is over time, students who do that blocked practice, that red line, yeah, they're going to look like they've performed better because, again, they're going to acquire the skill faster. So there is an advantage to blocked practice. When I'm teaching a new skill, it is great for students to do that blocked practice because I want them to increase their accuracy and their automaticity. I want them to get the flow of what they're doing. But I can't only do that type of practice because look at what happens to that red line. So by the second week, again, I'm not really having to think about it. I'm dropping off a little bit. If I don't visit it again by week 3, I've dropped pretty significantly. That's that. My kids did well on the spelling test Friday, but they don't know how to spell the words 2 weeks later effect. Whereas if I do interleaved, I don't do so well in the beginning because I'm not automatic and as accurate as I would like. But over time, my accuracy continues to improve, and you don't see it here, but you do see it in a lot of the other studies. But more importantly, I don't lose it. And so when we think about whole group intervention, that's one of the models to really consider, that interleaved cumulative review, because we're keeping those skills steady so that they can actually be applied and generalized and adapted. And one key point I would make around, again, whole group intervention is keep thinking to yourself as you're planning that. Will this benefit all students and harm none? So if that's true, then there's no problem and no negative consequence to doing that as a whole group intervention. So that's just, again, kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And if that's not the answer to the question and it's not benefiting all, it's just going to benefit some, and it could potentially cause harm in some way, then it's not going to be a good fit for whole group. So that finally gets us to where we want to talk tonight about what should small group look like. So you have to get all of that structure in place so that we can make sure that small group time truly is efficient and effective. And so when we are planning our small group time, keep in mind the cost of that. So if we are investing that time in our students, we have to give them exactly what they need, and we need to be efficient so that no one loses ground in that independent work time. So a couple of things that I always think about as I'm planning is I need to be very efficient. So this structure of small groups should be 20 minutes, and we do these rotations. We have to give ourselves grace to say, no, that's not something that we need to do. We need to be targeted, which means everybody's going to get what they need. So I don't need to be concerned about what's my warm up, what's my decoding focus, what's my comprehension focus. If I'm pulling students for small group, it's because they need something that I'm not doing in my universal instruction, and they need something very specific. This quote that I stumbled across a while ago was interesting to me, and it's Tim Shanahan, but a couple of points that he makes I feel like are worth drawing attention to. And he's talking about how many times we find ourselves in a small group setting basically teaching the same lesson many times. Maybe the only thing that's different is the decodable text that we're using or a phonics focus, but basically every lesson pretty much looks the same. So that's not targeted, that's not intentional, that's not specific. And so we don't want to use our small group time to teach this information. It really should be about narrowing our focus and being very intentional. And one of the second points that he makes here is think about being efficient. If we're trying to meet students' needs in a small group setting, we've just really condensed down the amount of instructional time we have, not just for that small group, but for our entire group too. And for most of us in the classroom, we don't have enough time anyway. And so we need to reserve that small time for what's very different and unique. So then the thing that I would draw attention to here is as we're really considering what the specific need is, I'd come back to these two frameworks that have really been reliable for us. One, the simple view of reading. So when we are planning our universal instruction that has a solid word recognition component and a solid language comprehension component, we hopefully, again, will reduce the number of students that have a specific and unique need. But when we do find that unique need, it's the sub-skills question that we're asking by isolating variables that will tell us what's the right amount of instruction they need and what's the right kind of instruction we need. So we should always be considering what do all kids need, that's universal intervention, versus what do some kids need, that's small group intervention. And one of the things that Foreman and Torgerson reminded us in terms of making that small group time different is that it should be more explicit. So even if our core instruction is teaching a concept and we know that we need to revisit it, we should be thinking about how can we make this more explicit? How can we prompt them, again, with verbal and nonverbal cues? How can we make it more concrete with manipulatives? Can we give them a reliable process or procedure to walk through? And that intensity that might occur from backing up just a little bit in order to go forward, and what that teacher support looks like. So those are the things that make interventions effective. When we talked about minimizing your small group time, some models that you might want to consider as you think about what tools are available to you. are here on the screen. So model 1 might be, I don't have another adult available, so I'm going to reduce my time down to 20 minutes. We'll see what that intervention looks like. But if I do have staff available and I'm going to utilize them, we're going to do simultaneous small groups. So within a 20-minute block of time, if there are 2 adults in the room, I've really, covered some ground, especially if those rotations that we're doing are specific and brief. Model 2 would be, I don't actually have adults available to support me, but perhaps between me and my peers teaching the same grade, we could share kids. And if we share kids and I have a group that has a specific need, I can increase the time that I'm working with them, but I'm going to do it as a larger group model. And I may have to split off a little bit, but that's one way to, again, minimize that independent time. And then model 3 would be, again, whether it's just me or a support person assisting, I'm going to drill down and only work on like this very small focus, 5 to 7 minutes, that's it. So again, if I'm not doing, a decodable passage where I'm covering every component of reading, I don't need 20 minutes. If I'm just working on a phonemic awareness skill, I can do that in a couple of minutes. Research says 5 minutes a day is enough for that phonemic awareness if it's focused and intentional. So if I am in that setting, I can still cover a lot of ground, but my lessons are abbreviated. So we're going to look at a data sample on the next slide. And as we're looking at it, the questions we're going to be asking ourselves are, first, can we find the students that are having difficulty? And a lot of your classroom data reports are color-coded to make that easier in some way. So that's pretty easy now to be able to do. The second question, not so easy. What specifically are they struggling to understand? So that's where our problem-solving system comes in of backing up. And then the next ones are really around, what am I skilled and comfortable with as a teacher? So do I know how to develop that skill? And then what am I going to do to figure out if they're making progress? So those are the things we'll be thinking about. So here's a data sample, and this is a school, real kids, that took 3 different assessments. They took a phoneme blending and auditory blending assessment. So the teacher said sounds, the student repeated back the word that those sounds created. They did a phoneme segmentation fluency assessment. Teacher said the word, students segmented the word into speech sounds. And then they did a nonsense word fluency assessment. So there's 2 columns to represent that data, their correct letter sounds and then their whole words read. And what we found in this data report is, and it could be sorted lots of different ways, that there's an area that a lot of kids are having difficulty with, and it's nonsense word fluency. So right there, I can see that that's going to be a whole group focus, especially because that whole word reading isn't an area that a lot of my kids have mastered yet. In fact, most of them are read. So that tells me that, again, this would be something to work on in a whole group setting initially. There might be students who still have a specific need there, and I'll address that as well, but that's definitely a whole group intervention. There are 2 prerequisite skills here that are high priority. My students are not going to be successful at nonsense word fluency if those 2 phonemic awareness skills are undeveloped. So I'm going to be really concerned about that phoneme blending. So I've identified students that need help. That is a small group focus for sure for this group of students. And then same with phoneme segmentation. So I already know what my 2 areas for my small group instruction are going to be. I probably don't yet know, though, why they're having difficulty in segmentation. Are they, just repeating the word back? Are they segmenting onset and rhyme? So I may need to drill down and get some more information. So when I use that data, I create my plan for what I'm going to do with these students. And I don't create a 6-week plan. I create a week plan because students are dynamic and some will move more quickly and some are going to need more time. So I've determined I need a phoneme segmentation group, and you can see the students in this group. And I've got a phoneme blending group. So these are 2, the segmentation and blending priority skills. They're going to get my most attention, and I'm going to work with these kids in these groups every day. It's going to take me probably 5 to 7 minutes for each one of these lessons that you see. So my model is using about a 30-minute small group block. Then I've got my phonics group that I want to work on word chaining with. And these were kids who had high correct letter sounds, but low whole words read. So I'm going to see if I can get them over that hump for whole word reading. And then I have a language comprehension group that I've noticed in my classroom instruction. They're having difficulty with syntactic awareness. So their comprehension difficulty is that sentences that are more complex, even in our read aloud, they're not understanding. So I'm going to work with them on that syntactic awareness. And we're going to work on focusing on the who and the do in the sentence. So what I would point out is that some of these students, and I color blocked it so you could see, appear in multiple groups.
I love that.
That's because I know that they have more than one skill need. And so by sharing these small groups, these groups are fluid and flexible. Oops, let me go.
It reminds me of that article from Florida Center for Reading Research, the Alternative Small Group Structures article.
Exactly. And that is a really good resource we should probably link in for people who have not read that one yet. And then I would point out that sometimes there are additional needs, like I've got a handwriting group. So I have a group I'm very concerned about. And so even though we're doing handwriting instruction whole group, these students have a different need. So because my syntactic awareness group isn't as intense in terms of their need, I can afford to alternate days and build things in. So what would that look like in an intermediate structure? Well, first, my skills are a little different. So this is a group of students who we used maze, we used oral reading fluency, and then we had to give nonsense word fluency to some just so we could see what the decoding skills looked like. A couple of students also were administered a diagnostic phonics screener. And so I have priority skill phonics. We've got some multisyllabic word reading needs that we need to meet. So that's my kind of intensive group here. And you can see the students that have been placed in that group based on their data. We're working on that vowel consonant vowel pattern. They're having a hard time flexing. Some of the issues there are also oral language related. If a word is not in your oral language, and you have difficulty recognizing the word, how are you going to know that the word is rodent and not rodent because it's not in your oral language? So we're going to do some oral language there as well. Make sure the vocabulary is there to support. We also have a group that's working on other language comprehension pieces. And so we've got plural possessives, singular and plural possessives that we're working on. They're having difficulty in their comprehension and in their writing. And then our other syntactic awareness and deconstructing sentences for meaning groups. So again, take a look at how some of these students are appearing in more than one group based on their data. And when my intervention is focused on a specific skill, it can and will be brief because that and that skill only is what we're working on. Then as we think about those groups, I just want to point out again what research tells us about the advantage of flexible groups. So it gives us that opportunity to meet a student's needs. So if I have a student that's actually a pretty high-performing student, but they have a specific skill need, in a traditional small group setting, they may not have landed at the teacher table working with me because they fell into that benchmark group. In this flexible group, kids have the opportunity to come over and join the group that they need for the skill they need, and then they're in and out as their data indicates. So that also has a benefit of preventing some negative social consequences that can occur from students thinking, I'm in a high group, I'm in a low group. It's all about the skill. And it gives us an opportunity to make sure that the knowledge is driving the group placements and not any sort of label or category that we're placing students in. Then
That's
a couple
so
of
important.
And it works, and they take ownership of that. And I see that working nicely in a lot of classrooms.
Yeah, and students at such a young age can figure out those things very quickly.
And teachers, which is why, we joke about if you've got a social problem to fix that requires organization, ask a teacher. I see so many really well-designed organization systems that tell students where they need to be and when that are, kindergarten students are managing. So If that's an area of need, that was an area of need for me as a classroom teacher, I'm sure there's someone in your building that has figured that out that would be happy to share. So to recap some points that we've talked about so far, when you're doing your targeted intervention, be really mindful about the specific skills. And I think I've probably said that phrase 100 times this evening, but you want to group them by the skill, not a broad concept, but something very specific and teachable and measurable. If you're doing a word recognition focus, chances are you're going to need to incorporate decodable text at some point, because remember, we need to apply and generalize and adapt. And decodable text is a natural interleaving opportunity, because I have to be able to come back and decode a word that's in my wheelhouse of cumulative review, and that's different than reading a pattern-based word list. So some things to think about. Make sure that the instruction that you're providing does align to evidence-based practices for structured literacy. And then don't forget that you may need to back up a little bit to move forward. So if foundational skills are lacking, we have to fix those first, even if they're not typically considered grade level skills. When you're doing language comprehension as a focus, make sure your text is rich in content. So this is probably not when I want to use decodable text. This is when I want to use something that students can't read, because I want to increase their vocabulary, background knowledge, and the sentence structure that they're exposed to. So that might require more read alouds in that intervention time. And I need to make sure that when I'm doing language comprehension work, I am doing both expressive and receptive. So there's no benefit to me doing all the talking. Students have to practice the language that I'm teaching. And so my focus is going to be very meaning driven. So those two types of interventions should look very different. And the thing we have not talked about is progress monitoring, because we have to make sure that they're reaching the level of mastery that we know that they need. So when you're progress monitoring, using an assessment tool that's part of your universal screener or your diagnostic battery will be helpful in some cases, but sometimes they're not sensitive enough. And one of the points that Susan Hall makes in her book is, if you know from that progress monitoring tool the outcome before you give it, it's probably not the right tool. And so informal assessments are often helpful, and that may be teacher created. So if, for instance, I'm working with a group that's having difficulty with distinguishing two specific short vowel sounds, I may need to create an assessment that gives me insight as to whether they've succeeded at that, because I can't find one off the shelf. So when you're using your progress monitoring tools, your goal should always be, what question do I need to answer about the content and the work that we've done together? And that should help. But then also making sure that there are opportunities to redo probes connected with your universal screener, because you have to see if you are closing that gap at any point. And then a final thought would be that problem-solving process needs to be embedded with your progress monitoring tools to, again, answer that question, and make sure that that spaced practice and interleaving, and not forgetting about how that all leads to, stages of mastery. It feels like I just kind of dumped it all in here on one slide. So basically, making sure that you're thinking about, what does mastery look like of that skill? And are we measuring that, or are we getting a false sense that students have mastered because we're assessing to the fluency level, and then we graduate them out of that intervention too soon? So are we assessing the right thing? Are we designing our small group time around that specific skill that's needed? And are we supporting them to that adaptation stage? When our small group has not been successful, we always need to ask that question of, is this indicating that a more formal intervention or assessment is needed? So to summarize, effective instructions are best preventative and proactive way of ensuring student success. Considering when we need to do whole group interventions is when most students in our room need that skill. We want to use our small group time to focus on exactly what students need. So everybody doesn't get the same thing. Everybody gets what they specifically need. And that is all possible through a problem-solving assessment system. So again, just towards the end, I want to make sure that you know that the references are here. And so Larissa, I am going to turn it back over to you before we conclude tonight.
Well, some of the things that are popping up in the chat frequently are the walk to learn model, which if you're in a school that has that model and you have maybe Title I teachers or reading specialists or some type of interventionist who's able to provide additional support outside of the classroom, how do you coordinate those services as a classroom teacher, knowing that you have a solid plan in place for your students? How do you maybe coordinate those services or onboard them with some of those effective teaching practices?
Oh, wow. That's a good and very loaded question. Well, so it all starts with your data. So I think you first as a group have to get together and make sure you know what the data is showing, because you got to figure out if there's a trend that all kids need. But then you also are going to have to match the skills that the teachers have with the student need. That to me is an MTSS framework that has to be there first and foremost. But I would say that in terms of a walk to intervention model, which I've seen work very effectively, the things you don't think about are routines and procedures, like just simple things. What do we do when the classroom teacher who normally provides that intervention is absent? Do the kids still go to that classroom and the sub, does something different? So it's those operational details that are also important. And then I think you also have to have a structure in place for progress monitoring. Are you sharing that data with each other? Is there time what happens when there is a need that indicates a student needs a different placement? How seamless can that be? But I would recommend, in terms of that broad question, I feel like in Susan Hall's book, there's a really nice sequence of steps that provide some guidance around how you could structure that in your school.
Thank you. You really generated a lot of interest in the spaced practice. On your references page, are there particular resources that some of our participants could go to look to learn more about spaced practice?
I'm looking at the reference page now. So I don't feel like there is a lot here around spaced practice. The second one beneath Anita Archer is really a website, and that website will take you to a couple of different places. And it is, if I remember correctly, I think that's a cognitive scientist page. So it gives some examples of different types of practice. And then on the slide that is a graphics references, there are links there that also direct you to other websites that talk about different types of practice. But that's actually my topic of study for my dissertation. So I've got lots of articles. If anyone is interested, I'm sure we could make a table of resources available.
That would be wonderful. And we do plan to send out the recording. And then Jamey, I think you're going to share your slides as well.
Absolutely.
We'll send that out in an email to everyone. I know there are some folks here that want to share with maybe an administrator or a colleague. So that is wonderful. No, I am looking to see if there's just any more last minute questions.
I did have one. In fact, Amy just reminded me,
Yes.
2 texts that might be interesting for people. Make it stick. Make it stick. I'm actually on my 3rd read of that book right now. But it's very practical in terms of giving you background on why that effortful retrieval is so beneficial, even though we don't like it and it feels uncomfortable and awkward. What's the science behind it? What do we know about it? And then effective teaching, I think that's the name of the other one. Powerful teaching. And that's also a really nice book in terms of giving very practical tips on quizzing, like the use of quizzing and the use of different interactive techniques to help force that spaced practice and retrieval. So those are really good suggestions.
Okay. That is all great. Thank you so much again for coming on and joining us and presenting on this. I think it validates a lot of what people are doing, but then it also gives us the opportunity to enhance what we're doing and share our practices with those that we work with. So it's exciting to share the good work and help students.
Thank you.
And if you, would you be able to share that first slide again, or I guess it's the second slide with the feedback form? We would love your feedback about other topics you would love to hear more about in the future at upcoming webinars.
Pull that back up. I should not have closed it. All right, let me share that for you. Here we go.
All right, thank you, Jamey, and thank you everyone for attending. Thank you so much for your feedback.
I just wanted to say thank you, Jamey. Thank you, Larissa. This was really, really wonderful. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Amy. Jamey, I'm just reading some of the comments in the Q&A, and everybody is saying thank you so much. They appreciate you. Thank you for sharing your expertise.
I'm excited to see all the spaced practice questions.
Yeah, that's a hot topic. And Larissa,
really
you can stop
generated
recording if you want to stop recording.
Yeah.
Just to head it down.
Thank you for that reminder. See if I know how to do this.